join our Patreon. Did Jesus Exist series. We are MythVision. Did Jesus Exist with Dr. Robert M.Price. James, the brother of Jesus, I meant James, the brother of the Lord, is used often by Christians and historicists to refer to an earthly James who was a brother, a biological kin to a man named Jesus Christ who actually existed not too far off from when Paul is on the scene writing his letters. Now, I know I've heard Dr. Richard Carrier mention things. I've heard historicists argue for why he must have been a kin. What are your thoughts on the topic? Give us some of your ideas and things that you've picked up with this. And is this really a valid case to be made, really proving Jesus was a historical person?
Well, like the Last Supper passage in 1 Corinthians, to say that this attests a historical Jesus as a contemporary of Paul is by no means an implausible view. If that's all there were to it, that would probably be the best explanation, the best reading of that. But there's a number of questions that arise with it. For one thing, by itself this is not earth-shaking, but as you said, it doesn't say the brother of Jesus. It says the brother of the Lord, which is theological or Christological language. Now, I may be reading too much into it, but it's interesting that the great book by Robert Eisenman, James, the brother of Jesus, the secret to unlocking the secrets, the key to unlocking the secrets of early Christianity, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the fastest 1,200 pages you're ever going to read. It's great. He says that even he says in the title, Jesus' brother, not the Lord's brother. Are they necessarily the same thing? I'm not too sure. For one thing, there's a study by, I think it's Anthony T. Hansen, about the pillar. It's called the Pillar and Ground of the Truth, which is a reference to something in Titus, I think. And he shows how this is well-known rabbinic terminology referring to Jewish myths and legends, that the foundation or the ground of the truth refers to the great capstone in the floor of the Jerusalem temple, which was mythologized, so that they thought this was the spot from which the waters of Noah's flood spewed up. Of course, there wasn't a temple there. The temple would have been built around it later, but that's where the water came up and flooded the earth. And so the great stone there was meant as a stopper, so it would never happen again. And this is, it was in the temple. There was also the brazen sea, right, which is a symbol of the Tahom, the ocean depth from which the world was drawn. And so if Peter is called the rock on which the church is built, that's a reference to that temple mythology. What about James and John? Well, there's an ancient dispute over who are these guys. Are they John? It must be John, son of Zebedee. But who is James? Is James his brother, James the son of Zebedee? Or is it James the Just, the brother of Jesus? And then they try to say, well, really cousin of Jesus, though the evidence is pretty lame linguistically. But then some Catholics say they're the same guy anyway, which is possible, that he just had a couple of different epithets. Well, they are called Boanerges, the sons of thunder, and which doesn't exactly mean that, but there's a parallel Sumerian word where the suffix is made into the prefix, which is done with these names all the time. Like that didn't matter. You'd have like a, Yahoel. The Yah is the prefix for Yahweh, but Nehemiah, it's the suffix. The same thing. The Sumerian would have been Geshpuanor, changed to Boanerges, and that was a name for Castor and Pollux, or the Sumerian equivalents, who were the upholders of the vault of heaven, and that's what Geshpuanor would have meant. Well, the temple mythology included these two pillars of Boaz and Jachin. Why were they given names? I mean, there's some kind of cosmic symbolism there. And the temple, as all ancient temples, were believed to be little models of the universe. And so we have the pillars that hold up the firmament, and the rock, which was the basis of the universe that stopped of the flat earth, which stopped the water from flooding it again. Well, if those are surviving vestiges of who the three pillars were, that implies they have cosmic theological identities independent of whether there was a guy behind them who was the Christ. That's something nobody ever mentions. So would they have been brothers of anybody, or disciples of anybody, or were they the big cheese there? That's an interesting angle on mythicism. Okay, so brother of the Lord could have a similar cosmic sort of significance, meaning brother of the Lord Yahweh. That would be a vestige, a loose end of a forgotten mythology, but it's not too surprising, especially when you think of somebody hundreds of years later, I think the 19th century. I can never remember this guy's name, but he was the leader of the Taiping Rebellion in China, and he called himself the younger brother of Jesus. Well, he didn't mean he personally was thousands of years old. He meant that he was the earthly avatar, whatever, of Jesus in heaven. It was a sort of a syncretistic Christian sect. I mentioned this, and Bart was really laughing me to scorn on this, and I said, I'm not saying one was borrowed from the other, but the same title, basically, it could mean the same thing. You could call yourself the brother of Christ, brother Jesus of the Lord, and not mean you were a blood sibling of somebody. So we're not sure that brother of the Lord means Jesus, like Wally and the Beef. We don't know that for sure. That'd be entirely plausible, but if you had other reason to wonder if there were a historical Jesus, it could very easily mean something else. Well, Richard Carrier says that he thinks brother of the Lord simply means Christian, and that's all there is to it. I can't really buy that. What are the other ones? Chopped liver? He must mean something else. He's almost right, in my opinion. Oh, did I say the thing about the Jesus and James, sons of Damnius, was theory of Richard Carrier? I think I did. I want to make sure I give him credit.
I'm not sure if you did,
but at any rate, he's very sharp-eyed, and though I don't agree with him on brother of the Lord meaning Joe Christian, I think he's pretty much right that G.A. Wells was right on target when he said that seems to have been a name for a group of missionaries and not just Christians. And is he just talking out of his hat there? Well, no, because in 3 John it refers to these circuit riding preachers, and it says you should care for the brethren because they've gone forth in the name, and we ought to support such men. And in Matthew 25, the famous sheep and goats parable, He says to the goats who are about to be roasted, he says, insofar as you didn't help the least of these my brethren, you didn't help me. And my brethren, who's he talking about? Just the poor? That's the favorite social gospel verse, but I'm afraid that's not what it means. Remember in the mission charge where Jesus tells the disciples who are going to go out and preach, he says that don't take any supplies with you. But when you enter a village, find somebody who will give you shelter and feed you, because the laborer is worthy of his hire. But if they won't help you and just slam the door, shake the dust off your feet and say, know this, the kingdom of God has come near. You had your chance. So the judgment will fall on those who don't help the missionaries of Jesus. Who are called, and that's who Matthew 25 is talking about. These people were spurned and scorned by the people they were preaching the gospel to, and so now you asked for it, buddy, you're damned. So if that's what it means, and then I think later on in the Didache or whatever, you have the brethren too in that sense. Well, it seems to me that's what it means that James was in charge of them. In fact, in 3 Peter, the epistle of Peter to James, it talks about how James was the head of the wandering missionaries and that Peter was reporting to him. In the Gospel of Thomas, the disciples come to Jesus and say, we know you're going to depart from us. Who do we go to then? And he says, wherever you have come from, on your journeys, go to James the Just, for whom heaven and earth were created. So there's good reason to, admittedly, these are just little isolated tiles in what must have been a bigger mosaic, but that's all we got to work with, so we have to see what kind of sense we can make of it, and it remains tentative. But there is reason to think that James is depicted as the head of the brethren, the apostles, as they're also called, not meaning the 12, but just any of the missionaries. So it doesn't necessarily mean a blood brother of Jesus. Now, there could have been a James and the 3 pillars and all that. Where would anybody have gotten the idea that one of them, James the Just, was the flesh and blood brother of Jesus? Well, we've got a ready parallel in the New Testament in the case of John the Baptist. Only in Luke are we told that John the Baptist was the cousin of Jesus. Why is that? Well, it's pretty clear from various things in Luke and John that Luke is trying to get John the Baptist followers, who were still organized in the 2nd century at least, to jump ship and come over to join the Jesus movement. And so what are they going to do with John? Well, some Christians stupidly characterize John as a false prophet, virtually an antichrist. Not a good idea. But this approach was to say, hey, John would want you to be with us. In fact, he was the cousin of our Lord Jesus. And I think it's a way of patching the two groups together, which is what they used to do throughout the Old Testament, right? That what do the tribes of Israel have to do to each other, with each other? Well, they federated. They were originally independent, but they told the story to seal the deal that their patriarchs were all sons of a single man. And there's loads of examples of this in the ancient world, even outside of the Bible. So that's what they did with John the Baptist, and my guess is that's what they did with James the Just. He's especially if he was believed to be the successor of Jesus. It's a way of uniting the two groups. This has plenty of historical analogies. It's not some wacko theory, though it certainly is unfamiliar because nobody else says it, but it's very biblical in style and substance. But the crowning issue here is that it looks like the passage where he says he met none of the apostles except Cephas and James, the Lord's brother, is an interpolation. It wasn't a mythicist that came up with this. In fact, it was a scholar who was arguing against mythicism, but he introduced it. And he said, and others have said too, it's very odd that Tertullian loves this section of Galatians and uses it as a club to beat Marcion. Because it has to do with, did Paul think he was subservient to the 12? And it kind of looks like he thought he was. He had to go and put his ideas on the table to see what they would think. Well, Tertullian mentions the other one, the other visit Paul talks about. He went there once, and then he went again and saw the rest of them and so on. But he only mentions the one, Tertullian only mentions as part of Galatians, the second visit, the one where James is not called, I think he just talks about the pillars. He doesn't say James, brother of the Lord in this one. Well, that's the one Tertullian mentions as Paul's visit to Jerusalem. He doesn't say what the Galatians text now reads, second visit, just his visit, as if that were the only one. And the one that it does mention James would have suited his polemical purpose better. So it seems pretty clear that this wasn't in the letter to the Galatians when Tertullian was reading it in the late 2nd century. So we don't know that it wasn't, but that's all you've got with these arguments. It's certainly that undermines any confidence we might have in saying, okay, this is it. He met Jesus' brother and so on. And he said, I don't remember when Jesus used to change clay birds into real ones. What a card that kid was. And so if you're going to build that whole thing on that whole edifice, it's like the guy that built the house on sand. It might mean that. It might have been in the text, but we don't know.